Thank you, David. Thank you, Ecology Center, for the invitation. Tucker in particular, and Sarah, and Reagan for hosting and showing me around. And so I'm gonna move here though, because I don't like being behind the thing, and I don't want to be. The attention's there, not here, really. So, I'm going to talk about this. You'll see, those of you who saw yesterday, you'll see, I don't know, some fraction, maybe half the slides are slides that you saw yesterday, but they'll be embedded in a little bit more science-y, less of a story thing. It's a different kind of a story today, talking a little bit more about the science of things. So, and focusing on these kind of extreme events. These are the kind of extreme events, but driven by, but maybe it doesn't work so well from here. I'm actually wondering if the battery's not very good on this, because I was having trouble when it started too. It's inconsistent in its reaction compared to yesterday.
You can get new batteries in it.
And that won't do. Yeah. Let's see if that helps. Yes, that helps. Thank you. So focus of the talk's really about, in particular, about warmer temperatures. One of the sort of the ask on this. And the second talk was sort of, well, what kind of stuff are you working on most recently? And for the last 10, 15 years, been really working on trying to understand better how much drought and heat stress, increasingly the heat part of it. Everybody's known that drought can kill plants. But the effects of warming temperatures, which is the most robust part of climate projections, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the effects of this on individual species and vegetation as a whole. And part of that uncertainty has to do with the feedbacks to these kind of disturbance processes, from physiological direct effects from hot or drought extremes, but to effects, this was supposed to also include like plus insects, wildfire, floods and debris, biotic agents. But anyway, this idea of tipping point changes, novel ecosystems, where's the world going? There's a lot of uncertainty about that. Maybe it's just slow. Anyway, in one sentence, this is sort of about what I'm going to be talking about today, and a little bit of the science behind it, and going to be working with a lot of examples from my favorite landscape and then scaling bigger. So the landscape I know best and have spent my whole adult life in here at the south end of the Rockies, that little bump at the arrow, which zooming in is the one with the red dot, the Jemez Mountains, where I've been working for quite a while. This is indeed my home landscape. My office has been based in Bandler National Monument continuously since 1986. I've been working there since 1982, doing landscape ecology, forest ecology, not landscape ecology so much in the kind of modeling sense people think of it today, but doing work at landscape scale on all kinds of different phenomena. But a key part of it is this place-based notion as a researcher is being co-located with land managers. And so a significant part of my work has been applied, trying to help people understand what's going on in that landscape and solve issues. There's a 5,000-6,000 foot elevational gradient in that landscape from the Rio Grande at the foot to peaks over 11,000 feet actually in the mountain range, and the whole array of vegetational zones along that. There's a central caldera. It's a big volcanic landmass about 1 million years ago, were the big eruptions that created this central caldera. We're looking at just the southeast, 20% of the caldera there, which was a lake during most of the Pleistocene. So think like Crater Lake, except 15 miles across with, about 10 islands in it, big islands, forested islands. Warming, why warming? Well, because this is what's going on the planet. So through 2017, planet's getting warmer. And this is incorporating the ocean temperature anomalies as well. And it looks like that's going to continue. That's same trend has been going on in the Southwest. This is this is for basically it's the PRISM data, the spatial extrapolated grid data across Arizona and New Mexico through 2007 there. But you see the warming, the strong warming that's emerged recently since circa 1980 in the region. One of the important papers that I was part of on this effort was Park Williams, who was a postdoc at Los Alamos National Laboratory at the time. And this is an outgrowth of Park's dissertation work, where he's looking at tree ring data from across the continental U.S. and looking at climate, forest growth, forest stress relationships. And as he zoomed into the Southwest using all the available tree data from all these sites, it was hundreds of thousands of measured tree rings, he pulled out a temperature signal. So the story associated with this paper is right there in the title. Temperature as a potent driver of regional forest drought stress and tree mortality. So the tree ring record goes back actually more than 2,000 years in northern New Mexico. He did it for 1,000, worked on it. Here's the period of calibration between the regional tree growth of all those hundreds of thousands of tree rings during the last century or so, back to I think 1896 was when the instrumental record, when the PRISM data start. And this is the actual tree ring growth record for the Southwest region, which was that area of Arizona, New Mexico, and southernmost Colorado and Utah. And above the line is good growth, below the line is not so good growth. And it turns out that using just a simple, basically two-variable predictor of tree growth from the instrumental record during this period of overlap with the climate record, the basically winter-spring precip, if you want to predict what tree growth is going to be like for this year, if you got winter-spring precip for the preceding winter-spring, and growing season daily max temperature, averaged monthly, which in this case we converted to something called vapor pressure deficit, which I'll explain in a minute, and actually a little bit about the end of the previous growing season. But this is the strong one, this piece here. You predict with these amazing R-squareds regional tree growth. The paper's got all the big tree ring climate reconstruction people on it. Not all of them, but many of them. In part because they contributed some unpublished data to get the data set big. But the preceding winter precip, no surprise, in the Southwest has this bimodal precip regime. And actually even more recently to this, they're starting to pull out the summer monsoonal precip signal and being able to reconstruct that from a few tree species in the Southwest, separating from the winter signal. But the winter signal has been the dominant signal, and this is where tree ring dating was invented, was in the Southwest in Arizona, and why it worked, because that's a strong signal. But nobody pulled out this temperature signal before. And basically the signal is when it's warmer during the growing season, trees grow more poorly. When it's wetter before, in the winter before, they grow better. But that temperature signal was something new, and it turns out the temperature signal was a little bit more than half the strength of that statistical relationship. And it was done on three main tree species: pinon, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir. So from low to higher elevation, which bracket most of the forest zones in the study area. And statistically, it was the same for each of the three species, so you could lump them together. So this is lumped together for the whole big data set, which is presumably why this was such a strong relationship here. If you use daily, by the way, if you just use daily max temperature average monthly here instead of vapor pressure deficit, this goes down by 1/100th. All right, so it's not a big deal. We use vapor pressure deficit because we think this is why warmer temperatures make trees grow more poorly. So what is vapor pressure deficit, VPD? VPD is the unmet demand for moisture in the atmosphere. So if you take a parcel of air, like the air in this room, and you heat it up, it's just physics. The physics of it is that it can hold more water vapor if it's warmer. So at equilibrium. And so it wants to, in a sense. Okay, so the air, it's a pull by the atmosphere on the Earth's surface, which it pulls water from plants through transpiration out of their stomata, and it's pulling it out of the soil when there's a big deficit. It's the unmet demand for moisture. And one of the interesting and important properties of it is that as this daily max temperature goes up linearly, this unmet demand for moisture goes up non-linearly. So a little bit of temperature increase at the beginning doesn't matter that much, but as it starts going up more and more, the effect of this vapor pressure deficit goes up strongly. Okay, and what does that do? Why do the trees grow more poorly? Well, when the air gets to, when the demand gets high enough on the tree, and if the soils are dry, the trees risk the water columns in the trees to get water to the leaves and needles up at the leaf surfaces, which could be 100 feet or more away from the ground surface where they're pulling the water from the soil. It's basically water molecules evaporate, but we call it transpire in a plant, off the leaf surfaces from little pores on the leaf surface called stomata. And literally it's connected, just the surface tension, the tension between the water molecules pulls. When that water molecule goes up, it pulls the next one in line all the way down. And so it's pulling these, but when the soils get dry, the soil is holding on to the water too. And there's a certain tension that plant physiologists you can measure, called the plant water potential. And at some point, if that plant water potential, and it's different by different species, if it gets too much, it'll break the little conduit. There's the wood cells just underneath the bark and the xylem tissue are basically connected vertically. And so there's little connectors between them. And it's literally, so there's thousands of these little water columns, water going up into the leaf surfaces. And if half of those pop because the tension is too great or so, the plant isn't going to recover, it's going to die. I mean, it's different with different plants. But this is a bad thing for a long-lived organism like a tree. They don't want that to happen. So to avoid that, many species close their stomata, including the conifers that we worked with, all these Pinnaceae species. So what happens when the VPD goes up more, when it's hotter during the growing season, especially in dry years, these plants, to avoid having the water columns get embolisms in them, or cavitate is the term plant physiologists use, to avoid that, plants close their stomata. But those stomata, those pores on the leaf surfaces, are the same place where gas exchange with the atmosphere occurs for photosynthesis. CO2 in, pull off the carbon, oxygen out. So when it's closed because of water stress, the plant can't photosynthesize. In the short run, that's not a big deal. It happens diurnally on a daily basis during hot parts of the year, typically in our part of the world, down in the southwest. But when it's protracted for weeks, months, chronically, and for years, it affects tree growth. It affects how much photosynthesis they can do and thus how well they can grow. We think that's why it works. But in any case, that's a really strong relationship. And this statistical relationship is so strong that basically from just these two climate variables, we can predict tree growth. At least for the last century plus, it works really well. And we presume then, if from climate variables we could predict going forward, and from tree ring width patterns in the past, we could also estimate these variables in the past, which we do here shortly. So this is a 1,000-year perspective on that. This is looking at tree growth for the last 1,000 years, or forest drought stress index. So we called this two-variable predictor, by the way, forest drought stress index, kind of a play on Palmer drought stress, PDSI, so we call it FDSI. So you'll see this sometimes as FDSI on a graph. But it's basically the same thing as tree growth, and we treat them more or less interchangeably in the graphs that you see here moving forward. The gray are the individual years for the last 1,000 years, back to 81,000. The red is a 10-year smooth put through it. The main point of this graph is that climate is naturally extremely variable in this part of the world. That's not a new phenomenon at all time scales. Okay? So and the 10-year smooth, look at the red. So it's wet and it's dry and it's wet and it's dry. Again, above the line is wet and below is dry. Come on. There we go. These are some extreme drought episodes in the past. So here's the late 1200s drought that drove the ancestral Puebloan people out of the Four Corners. It was kind of the last straw, and they pushed south. And mostly to river valleys where there was better water supplies. This is the late 1500s drought, which was thought to be the worst mega drought in the last millennium, until possibly the drought we're in now in the Southwest. This only goes through 2007. It's continued all the way through this year. 2018 was brutal in our part of the world. This is the 1950s drought, which was the last previous drought in the 20th century, and we got a lot of information about that relatively in terms of historic records, air photos, all kinds of things. So these are some big droughts, but it's normal. In the 50s drought looks like, yeah, it was a severe drought, and it's back here. But you can see, like the 1580s, there's just no good years in there. The late 1200s, very difficult from that standpoint. This, we know that the 1950s drought, and we infer that the late 1500s drought killed trees. So we took basically the worst, I forget the metric, worst 25% of the years in these two droughts, the 1280s and 1580s droughts, and somewhat arbitrarily called that a tree mortality level of stress. We know the 50s drought killed trees, and it was just barely getting down to that. So there's this line you'll see here, just kind of a reference point. If you're getting down to that level, the drought level stress, the level of stress that on parts of the landscape, trees can be dying out there. And then this year, 2002, if you look at that individual year, there's nothing like that moving across. So the trees are telling us that the year 2002 was the worst year for tree growth in that entire record back to 2000. We do think that actually 11, 12, 13, maybe 18, maybe 16, 2016, these are all really bad years. When we have regional tree ring records, those might show up pretty close down here. Anyway, what's different here, we don't think 2002 was drier than these years in the 1580s where there was like no relief whatsoever, but it's that difference that it's warmer now. That the warming is starting, that signal is starting to amplify the drought stress on these trees in the last 30 years. And there are these temperature-related forest disturbance processes. So in addition to growth, warmer temperatures also amplify fire in a variety of ways, sort of the amount of fire activity, the severity of it. You can start getting tree mortality both from direct physiological cavitation effects as well as the trees are weakened, and the warmer temperatures help many insect populations reproduce faster. And so this forest drought stress index here is FDSI and 2-year running mean FDSI, which was completely done just to predict tree growth, not coincidentally, is strongly correlated with the area of bark beetle impacts of areas mapped by the aerial detection surveys where people fly and map them manually. And you can see it's tracking pretty close here for the area of overlap. This is the overlap of those data. And for the area of tree-killing fire, which, despite its problems, is taking the monitoring trends and burn severity products, and you still get these kind of strong R-squareds around 70%, 0.7. So, observationally, we know that. Really dry drought periods, we have a lot of trees dying from insect attack, some combination of insect and physiological dieback, and fire activity is a bigger deal. So. And then just sort of a reminder that pre-1900, we've done an immense amount of tree ring work and in terms of reconstructing fire history in many landscapes in the Southwest, including the one I've been based in, the Jemez, looking at fire scars in the woods, annual rings. For 70% of them, we can even estimate the season in which it formed by the relative position of the scar within the annual growth ring. And what they show is a record across most of these montane forest zones of high-frequency surface fire, on the order of 5 to, well, places around Flag, some of these places are closer to 2 or 3 years, but in general, sort of 5 to 15-year intervals in ponderosa pine and most of the mixed conifer forest types in the region. That all changed in the late 1800s. Land use was a factor in it, and we think it was triggered. This is one of those kind of tipping point changes where the system behaved different by the medium that was carrying these fires, sort of the matrix that allowed fire to propagate widely as low severity, not tree killing fire for the most part, was grassy kind of herbaceous fuels and to some extent needles. It's hard to even perceive now because livestock grazing is regulated differently, but when the railroads arrived in the 1880s to this part of the world, it triggered it. It basically, this place like New Mexico was more or less a subsistence economy prior to the entry of the railroads. It connected it to outside markets, the outside world, outside capital. British and Eastern U.S. capitalists came in, invested, figured out ways to steal land, buy land, and by the 1890 census there were 5 million sheep and 1.5 million cattle and hundreds of thousands of horses and burros and whatnot grazing in open range conditions on the public land. Meaning, open range meaning there were no permits. People tried to control access by homesteading the water sources, but if you wanted to put 100,000 sheep, if you could manage somebody to stake you for that, and you could run them out there, and people did that until they ate the landscape to nothing. There was then a drought in the 1890s into the early 1900s, and by that point in time, these landscapes were, the grass that had carried the fire had been chewed off over huge parts of the area. The trails from trailing also were initiated royal cutting. Anyway, a lot of big changes. And the surface fires stopped in the 1880s and 1890s, several decades before active fire suppression was a government policy. That did not happen until the summer of 1910. Major fires, especially in the northern Rockies, but to some extent west-wide, that killed several hundred people. There was a debate about whether fire was a good or bad thing in these ecosystems prior to that. There were arguments that you could see you had beautiful forests with fire. But that triggered it, and sort of in the Forest Service as a young agency went into this full-on 10 a.m. fire suppression policy. But the initial suppression was a result through most of these landscapes in the West of a change in the surface fuels. And as a result of that, these kind of open forests with grassy understories in southwestern montane forests turned into things that looked like this, these dog hair thickets of varying ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, in this case Doug fir, white fir, coming in the understory, and 1,500 stems per acre in this kind of a plot setting for this. So at the scale of a stand, you had these ladder fuels developing, and this allows threshold responses of fire behavior, where fire, instead of remaining on the ground, can climb those ladders, and once they get into the canopy, there's so much convection they actually start to generate their own weather. So there's winds pulling in, the convection up, oxygen in. If there's any kind of horizontal wind, these things can move and blow and go, as they say. And that didn't just happen at the stand scale, it happened at the landscape scale. And so I talked a little bit about this yesterday too. But these slopes were all open, infilled, kind of an order of magnitude increase in stand densities, stand basal areas, maybe not order of density increases in canopy covers, but in some cases, but of woody fuels in these systems, allowing canopy fires to be able to transmit a lot farther before they'd have to drop to the ground. That's the setup for what happened in the last 30 years, the transition that's happened and that I've lived and worked through in northern New Mexico. So I showed this sequence yesterday, but I'm going to go just a little bit slower and explain a little bit better. So this is that forest drought stress index, or tree growth, back to 1896 through 12 in this case. We updated it a little bit, estimated it. These are dry periods. So here's that circa 1900 drought period. This is when the surface fires end by 1900. It's variable by site. Here is the 1910 year that triggered the change in policy to active fire suppression in the West. This is 1919, the kind of iconic classic year of ponderosa pine regeneration, well documented by Gus Pearson in the Flagstaff area and others regionally. But you see we had this multi-year, multi-decadal really wet period here in the teens and 20s, and that happened to be a really good year in that part of the world. But a lot of tree establishment happened without surface fire thinning the system. The 1950s drought, which we saw what that looked like on a 1,000-year kind of time scale, was a significant drought, and there was some uptick in fire activity and some increase, significant increase in tree mortality. I and others have documented some of that tree mortality work. And then here's this period from the late 70s into the mid-90s through 95 of a generally wet period. And all these little baby trees that established in the teens and 20s had by this point grown up. And the system, and by the end of that, and fire suppression was working well during this period, despite this buildup of fuels that by now, after almost a century, we've got at the site level, at the landscape level, we've got abundant fuels and the potential for bombs, right? Basically, there's been all this stored energy is stored on these sites, a century worth of fuel and energy buildup. And I would assert that by this point, in the early 90s, we were probably at the maximum potential biological expression of biomass, carbon, leaf area, stand density, that these stands could, that this part of the world, under any circumstance, could have on them. Because of this combination of 100 years of no surface fire thinning, 2 wet periods that facilitated establishment and growth and kept the lid on some of the disturbance processes that now we're going to start, that we are seeing unleashed in a major way when we go into this next dry period. And when immediately with that first dry winter of 95, 96, with all across the region, we started pop fires of in the teens, from 10 to 20 some thousand acres, where a third of it is stand replacing fire. And we thought, ooh, those were huge fires, okay? Huge fires once you get cross more to 10,000 acres. And we started to see a lot of dieback from other processes, drought stress and related insect. And then, again, I showed this yesterday. So this is my timeline, and I use this to emphasize, this is my frame of reference. I'm here studying landscape change, reconstructing using multiple lines of evidence how these systems have changed. You could see, meadows and grasslands had been invaded by trees and covered, and the forests had densified, and you could see fire was such an important process for many centuries prior to 1900. And you knew that the 50s drought, it was bumping up against it, and so you didn't need to be have a great crystal ball to say, the next time it goes multi-year dry, probably stuff's going to happen here in these forests. And it has been. And to a significant degree, what I've done in this career is document the transition from this to this, and but it's not a kind of meanwhile, we got climate change going on, and it's warming, and drought's behaving different, and the system it's not just going to go back. In the past, it oscillated like this. That's natural. But now we're on something different, a new trajectory. And this is a slide I guess I'm not going to talk about because I'm going too slow here through this. But it's an idea of structural overshoot. There's a paper that Alistair Jump 2017 you could look at. It's kind of a conceptual paper about how these wet periods, well, I will go back and just say this, that if the only data you had were from like the first 10 years I'm in the Jemez, data from the 80s and 90s, if this is the only information you had about forests and forest growth and forest disturbance processes, you would say, wow, what a great place to be a tree. Arizona and New Mexico is in these mountain forests. I mean, look at, there's density, a massive reproduction, fire suppression's working. This could just keep going on forever. Foresters, silviculturists, they're trying to, keep that thing going. And some of us are feeling kind of nervous about it. That changed pretty quickly when we started to go dry and when we went multi-year dry. And now it's existential concern that forests, as we know them in the Southwest, will be completely rearranged on the landscape by 2050, in 30 years. All right, multiple modeling approaches suggest that trees can't grow where they have been growing historically by mid-century if the warming stays on just the warming alone, even if precip doesn't change. So anyway, this is the idea of structural overshoot, and that basically once you have, by growing more biomass, ironically you make it more vulnerable for multiple disturbance processes from fire to drought stress. I mean, if you got 100 trees competing instead of 10 for the same amount of water, they're going to be more stressed. Anyway, we've been seeing it. So these tipping point changes have been occurring, and they have directly almost forced the course of the kind of work I do, because This is what managers cared about. And ecologically, it was also what I cared about. I mean, it was so in your face. You had to deal with this stuff. This is what this looks like at the regional scale. So this is the study region of that Williams et al. Paper. And from 84 to 2012, the orange is mapped just bark beetles. No other insect disturbance process, but that's mapped patches of bark beetle mortality. And the red is tree-killing fire, and it totals to almost 20% for the period just through 2012. 84 to 2012, that period. So there's this big reset that's been going on. And almost all of that is since 96, really. So you have these temperature-related forest disturbances. We'll start with fire. So, as I mentioned yesterday, this is the, Los Alamos fire danger level extreme. We've seen a lot of this, these signs all at this extreme level. And this is all just standing literally in Los Alamos. You would see within just 10 miles of Los Alamos, these pictures are basically from there. This is how the Las Conchas fire, I'll go through this quickly. Those of you, this is the tree that started, it blew down in the wind at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Within an hour, we got these 500-foot flame lengths. The jet stream on June 26, 2011 was down over northern New Mexico instead of up towards the Canada border where it's more expected. And it generated an unusual kind, well, for the Southwest, a kind of fire behavior called a horizontal roll vortex, which is common in boreal forest zones because in the summer fire season, that's where the jet usually is. Anyway, crazy fire behavior of multiple sorts, especially on that first day run. It went 42,000, 43,000 acres in the first 14 hours. These photos are all from that. It started up in forests like this, burned through these watersheds. Then down to mid-elevation and off of the upland terrain, and there starts to be big canyons coming around the plateaus that are off that southeast flank of the mountain range. And huge areas. This is actually a reburn, so this is part of the area that burned in 96 in one of those first dry period fires, the Dome Fire in 96. All these areas where you don't see any snags surviving the fire are areas that had been crown fire patches from the 1996 fire. And this fire burned through that, and what surprised us is it killed most of the trees that survived that fire just 15 years before. We thought that system had the fuels restructured enough that it would be relatively resilient to the next fire, but not the way this one played out. You get these you get obviously direct effects on vegetation, but you get all kinds of effects on runoff and erosion processes when you take away this sponge. And human societies weren't geared for it because for 100 years there had been this sponge building up of canopy cover and, dense, thick needle mats, litter, right, on the floor of the upland watersheds where the water comes off. Los Alamos National Laboratory had a nuclear reactor and multiple plutonium handling facilities in the floodplain on the first terrace on canyons coming off of this hill slope, coming off the east side of the Caldera Rim. Because from 1943 when it started to the Cerro Grande fire in 2000, nobody had seen big fire in those watersheds. Fire suppression had been effective, and so this sponge just kept getting more and more effective, and trees were transpiring a lot of water. Base flow was down, but so was peak flows. Well, when you basically consume all of that overnight, you get really different kind of runoff and erosion behavior in these systems. Immediate rilling with the first storms. These things then can turn into debris flows on a lot of these slopes that are destabilized, mobilizing immense amount of sediment into the canyon bottoms and the stream systems. You get these floods. Floods go up 2 orders of magnitude. 100-fold increases in peak flows after thunderstorms is what we see in super well documented throughout this whole part of the world and throughout the West. But here, these summer thunderstorms are a major component of the precip. 40% of the annual precip comes in July and August and the first week or two of September in these convectional thunderstorms. And they're doing this to the system. So first they ream out all the sediments in the alluvial floodplain bottoms, and then where you have canyons big enough and you have the debris flow, then you got all the sediment coming in from the side that then fills this all up in a different way. So the whole geomorphology of the canyon bottoms and the hydrology is transformed and reconfigured in these things. Again, this is the mouth of one of the main watersheds in Bandelier where it hits the Rio Grande, and that delta reflects the amount of sediment. Again, at one point it had blocked the river, but it put so much sediment into the system that even though there's a reservoir downstream, a dam, Cochiti Dam, just about, 10 river miles downstream, but basically just at the foot of the Jemez, another 40 miles downstream, Albuquerque, even with that dam filtering out most of the sediment, capturing it as a giant settling basin, Albuquerque had to shut its water intakes for almost 2 months on the Rio Grande. They had to go back to their old wells systems that have some issues, and this is about the Rio Grande. These folks at UNM, University of New Mexico. I mean, this is up in the headwaters area. This is inside the caldera. What runoff's looking like down there. This is on the Rio Grande. This is just again hitting the Rio, damming in multiple places. This really caught the attention of society. Okay, they're like, oh. Yeah, because the existential health of the society, the valleys are where all the people live and where the economic activity and the farming takes place. And it directly, clearly, obviously connected the health of the human societies in the valleys and the dependence on water that's coming from upland forested watersheds. And so it's really triggered an immense amount of interest and support from private sector and government as well as NGOs to work on forest treatments, whether you want to call them restoration or hazard fuel reduction or whatever. And then the riparian zone. So this is a particular issue. So the park I've been based in, Bandelier National Monument all this time, the flooding went for actually 3 years, 11, 12, 13, extraordinary events. There was cranking 9,000 cubic feet per second twice down, and one 6,000 CFS event down. I'm going to show you the channel in a minute, down 12 miles downstream from where we're looking, down this canyon system on a stream with base flow of about 3 CFS. So, okay. And historic peak flows after thunderstorms of 50 during the sponge period when all this landscape was blanketed with forest. So this is actually, this is sort of when it's forested. This is long ago, a photo. And here is from near the same spot 2 months after the Las Conchas fire. So it took out 6 square miles every conifer tree, and that litter was consumed, literally overnight on June 26th into the 27th. And here is there's some permanent monitoring work the Park Service does down about halfway down that watershed, so just out of the field of view of that previous photo. Down in the bottom, there's the stream during actually a pretty wet period. And these are aquatic people, and they retook the same photos. So this is going to be a time series of this. So you're looking at exactly the same spot, or as close as they could retake it post-fire. So there it was a couple weeks post-fire. So look at that tree. I think, no, that tree got blown out. Here is October after the 6,000 CFS event in August. So it doesn't even look like the same place. You can't even hardly imagine that's there. And it almost looks to me like they must have turned it. But the channel has definitely moved in any case. And here it was after the two 8 to 9,000 CFS event. Anyway, this whole system has been reamed out, buried, and huge effects. I mean, the park was actually, the visitor center was closed in the summer half of the season for the next 2 seasons. They were so paranoid. Incredible log jams, debris jams on these things. I mean, that's the size of the material moving in those big events. Big events do all the work. That's certainly true hydrologically, but it's true for things like, not all the work, but they do a lot of work in these things. We have in these systems, and nobody's been working there, including me. I mean, we're doing it now. We have a project. We got funded this year. And we're trying to understand what's happened ecologically, hydrologically, geomorphologically. And there's a fair amount of baseline information that was collected in these systems. So we've got some things to work with, but nobody's been following it. This is an alder species near its northern range limit for this alder species. Beautiful individuals. It appears it's been extirpated from the park because it was only in these canyon systems. We can't find any regeneration to date. And it's a pity. Anyway. Some rare plant species that were only found in these floodplains and wet areas. And the floodplains were literally removed by the flooding. And now they've been redeposited as other things. But we can't find these plants. And we hope they're there. I mean, they're not globally endangered, none of these, but, and it's been hard on certain things like Mexican spotted owls are nesting in pockets of old trees in these canyons, and when those pockets get blown out, it's not good for the owls anymore. So anyway, this is work we're doing. These are 2 canyon systems we're working on in the riparian zone and some of the data sets, and this is the A team of riparian hydrologists, ecologists that we've brought in. These are USGS folks from up in Colorado who do this kind of stuff elsewhere, and we've been happy again. So again, like yesterday, what comes next in the uplands? That's another question. So we don't know what's going on, particularly in the riparian. Usually riparian systems, we're not that worried. You'd think they recover quickly. But these have been, it's been slow. The magnitude of these, it's probably been the early Holocene, like 9,000 years ago, the last time there were high severity fires of that magnitude and that kind of flooding and that level of debris flows. So it's been a while. And, you know, in these uplands, as we know, it's just the scale of these patches, especially where this is again in that reburn area of the dome fire, that you need some other trees. The seed sources, there's not persistent seed banks or canopy banks, soil seed banks for these things. And so, and meanwhile, the shrubs that had established here, this is again in that dome fire area reburn. This was just a week and a half after the fire. Burned through here, you see the ghost logs. All these little stems here are the oaks and robinia that had grown up in the 15 years into those crown fire patches from 96. And they burned, we'd never seen it burned like chaparral. These things were, 2 to 3 meters high. Nobody saw it burn out here, but that's what it did, obviously. But that stuff, I mean, that's a resilient life form. This was a really dry year, and they're still sprouting. They got enough below ground resources to do this. And so they're taking over these areas. And so we see this all over the place, and along with many other people in the region, we're starting to document these regeneration patterns. But it's not looking great for the conifers coming back in terms of being their ability to recolonize these sites. And in part because these open sites, the microenvironment changes and the climate's moving in a direction that's more difficult as well, at least on the sites they were on. So, and in the driest areas, it's really slow. So, in the more upland areas where there's more resprouting stuff, it's abundant. Aspen's doing fine in these areas. Karen and I talked yesterday. It was a big enough fire. There's a lot of elk, and there's been issues in the Jemez with elk knocking down but these last couple of fires have been big enough that it's swamping what they can do. So this should be updated. It's only through 2012. But we have a pretty big database of fires from old historic fire atlases onward, back to 1909, over 7,000 fires here. The dominated by lightning, but the red fires are person-caused fires, and you see they concentrate along roads and campgrounds and places like that if you know the geography there. So I'm going to go through it decade by decade, and so you can see how effective fire suppression was, even though there's some incompleteness to the older records. So 1909 is the first year, so this is for the first decade of the 1900s, and you can see these are on hand-drawn fire atlases that were laying around at the supervisor's office. And so there was a little bit of action. There's the decade of this should say the 1910s. It's not just 1910, so this is 1910 through 1919. When you see circles like this, that means that we had a locality and a size class, but we didn't have a perimeter mapped. So those are approximate. There's the 20s, there's the 30s, there's the 40s, there's the 1950s, right? This dry decade of the 50s, and regionally there were a couple fires that popped. Down in southern New Mexico that got up into the teens, a handful of over the course of the 50s of, 15,000 acres. I think there might have been even one or two that made it to 20. But in the Jemez it held. There's the 60s, here's the 70s. This is starting to get people's attention. This is 77, this is 76, 78. So in the late 70s, there are a couple of fires popped in Ponderosa. These are all in the heart of the Ponderosa Pine Zone, basically pure Ponderosa Pine systems. And this got people's attention. These are some of the biggest ones in that modern era. And this one in particular, because it was centered on Bandelier. It started on Forest Service, but burned and scared Los Alamos Laboratory here. This fire, the La Mesa fire, got attention. And there were some studies that went on there, and in the early 90s I got people to come back 15 years later and repeat studies. And so that one was pretty well studied. And but the laboratory, for example, they just never quite took it serious. This was something that you got this National Nuclear Weapons Laboratory sitting in the middle of a forest. And that used to burn all the time. So there's the 80s. Nothing went on in the 80s, right? There's the 70s. The 80s were wet. Suppression's working. And it worked into the early 90s. And then we get to the 90s, and the late 90s, this is the Buchanan burn. This is the Dome fire. This is actually some prescribed fires that the Park Service was doing in Bandelier, burning in the old La Mesa fire fuels, trying to keep it from getting thick again. The Oso complex. There's the 2000s. There's the literally infamous Cerro Grande fire, and that burned. This is into the laboratory. See, it's actually two fires, in a sense. Anyway, this had to do with some control problems. Park Service got blamed for this, but a lot of the bad decisions that affected the town site and the laboratory had to do with decisions made by the Type 1 team. It's one of the problems fire is still struggling to deal with. Fire teams, because the teams come in from the outside, they don't know the landscape, they got to make decisions quickly, and some of them coordinate better with local resources, local people than others. This particular one had kind of a alpha male hierarchy that didn't listen too closely to what the local, particularly Forest Service people, recommended a different strategy. Anyway, there's the first 3 years of the 2010s, and there's actually, should be one more, 2013. So there's the first 4 years of the 2010s, which you can compare to the entire record going back a century, right? I mean, so this is with more and more resources being poured on it, right? I mean, we've got all kinds of stuff that they didn't have back then. They were suppressing those things with shovels, getting to them on foot and horseback with no radios back in the teens, 20s, 30s. After World War II, there was all this equipment and bulldozers and chainsaws and air attack and smoke jumpers come in. And so people really ratcheted up the investment in suppression, and that's part of what, as the fuels were accumulating, was keeping a lid on it. But we can't keep a lid on it anymore, at least not with those kind of fuels buildup and not with the kind of climate we've had in this window. So that's the perimeter of the fire, and you go, ooh, big bad fire. That was, at the time, in 2011, this was the biggest fire in documented New Mexico history, which means post-1900. But we know from the triggering record, and again I showed this yesterday, there's a lot of ways to show it, from all these places in the Jemez, which we've now got a gridded network. We can reconstruct fire. There's the footprint of the Cerro Grande in gray, if you can see that back there. That's 156,000 acres. And all those red dots, yesterday I showed you, 1801, or maybe it was 1822 or 42. They all work. This is 1748, which happened to be the biggest fire year in the Southwest, regionally. Almost every mountain range in the Southwest was on fire like this, where we have fire scar records like this. So we're really confident that 1748 was the biggest fire year in the region, back to at least 1700. But again, but this is surface fire. This wasn't tree-killing fire. So as an ecologist, it isn't the footprint of the fire. We need more fire in these landscapes. There's actually been a massive historical deficit of fire in the 20th century. We want fire burning through landscapes, but we want more of it looking like this, and less of it looking like the worst parts of these high-severity fires. So what does the recent set of fires in the last 20 years look like on the landscape? So again, I showed this yesterday. These are the burn severity maps, but I'm going to show them again because they make the point, and I'm going to then summarize. So the dark brown areas, the green is low severity or unburned. This green is kind of messy on this one. It burned through there. It's poorly mapped. The dark are the tree-killing fires. The two darker colors are basically tree-killing severities of fire in this display. And then Las Conchas, boom, and we get the Thompson Ridge fire on top of that too. So how much tree-killing fire does that look like when you summarize it? Boom. That's the last 20 years. And it's basically gutted the forests on the east flank of the Jemez, is what you're looking at. And with huge patches. And there's little refugia. We're talking to some people today who are interested in refugia on the landscape. There's pockets in there, right, where they didn't all die. And if you zoom in more, there's littler pockets, but there's huge areas. The matrix flipped to non-forest in these areas. It went from super dense forest to non-forest. This is something that's I just got this a week ago from a colleague in Fort Collins, a remote sensing veg ecologist. And so here's 1992, and this is conifer cover, vegetation cover by different density classes, darker density, and deciduous cover. And he's used combinations of plots, air photos, and then temporal stacks, time series of Landsat imagery, kind of blending all of that to look at the changes in conifer cover. And so what I want you to see here, so this is 1992, still in the wet period, right, before the shift in 96. So here's the caldera. These are the grassy, old, ancient lake bottom basins that are meadows. Here's the forest. This is kind of ponderosa pine zone. This is the town site of Los Alamos, the town site of White Rock, which is down in PJ. This is the La Mesa fire footprint from 77. These low density areas in ponderosa pine, dense ponderosa pine zone. These are the other 70s fires over on this side. These are actually different. So you're going to see this. So now we're going to jump to 2016. And I'll toggle once or twice here. So boom, all of that, if you look in this zone here, right, all this dense conifer cover goes to non-conifer cover, all on that east flank. And this is pretty well calibrated. We're feeling pretty good about this. And what's replacing it, a lot of it is deciduous cover. These oaks and robinia and other things. Here's another way to look at it just cumulatively. So conifer gain over that time period is blue. So there's some areas where there's still some densification going on, maybe, in these things. I think it's a little iffy. This was a planted area. They tree planted that. And so they planted into one of those 70s burns, so it made it look better. And this is the deciduous gain, which is basically all the stuff that's resprouting in the system. Aspens, oak, robinia. So, and then real quick, I'll go through the tree mortality story of, drought and insect-induced tree mortality. So this is sitting at the foot of Los Alamos in fall of 2002, and those are all piñons that are dying, and actually, you can see that same tree is there. And it's a big, fast change in this system. This thing lags is what it does. It's not consistent. Come on. So anyway, that's what that looks like standing on the ground in one of those kind of places. Big, fast change. And it was all up and down the elevational gradient, multiple species and multiple life forms, grasses, shrubs, the veg stress. So you can see the 2000s, 02, 03, that really bad year, right, that looked really bad on the 1,000-year time frame. It was bad. And it was regional. It was all across the Four Corners area, at least down this way, probably not up this high. But this is the bad news out of the Park Williams story, is when you project moving forward. So if you remember this forest drought stress index, we can predict it. If you have the winter-spring precip and the daily max temperature, which you can convert into vapor pressure deficit, or you could keep it as daily max temperature. Well, the climate models, the climate projection models, kick out the variables you need to do this. So we can project forest drought stress index moving forward. We use 3 different climate models, ran them many times in ensemble mode. And if you average all the models, and these were non-extreme models, this was done in 2012. This is the mean of the model runs, and this is the inner quartile, 25% of the variability from the many runs, hundreds of runs that you get. So you see this trend. So here's the 0 line. This is the tree killing threshold line. There's 2002. Remember that worst year in the last 1,000 years? By way of reference, right there. And what you see is, and this is the record through 2007, and what you see, this, when you run these models and then you average it all together, it takes out the spikiness. Okay, so it compresses everything. So there's a certain amount of noise in here, or variability, but it's less variability than will really happen in the N of 1 world, right? Because there's only one run that the planet's going to go through in the next 70, 80 years. But the mean of it is, by mid-century, by the late 2040s, the average, the mean forest drought stress index is projected to be worse than the worst years of the worst mega droughts in the last millennium. And by the second half of the century, kind of forget it. This is an empirical model based on what the trees tell us about how they grow in response to winter precip and temperature, where they're sitting now. So it's a little worrisome, actually. So this is where, I don't know if this kind of news gets up here, but in New Mexico it's been widely reported that, forests are doomed by 2050, kiss conifers goodbye. There's going to be refugium sites, and it's probably, we may be due for, here's that up and down, right? Here was the 50s drought, here's the wet period of the 70s and 80s, here's the dry period that we're still in through now. But we're about due for the Pacific, which is driving this, something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, to slosh back. So we might have more favorable conditions for 10, 15 years. But when it sloshes back down, it'll be below that line, probably. So anyway, yeah, so it'll look more like that, probably. It'll play something out different than that. But anyway, it looks like really bad news, all right, for this part of the world. But again, if all you had for information was from the 80s and early 90s, you'd say, wow, forests are great here. This is a cautionary tale for places today where forests are growing well. So there hasn't even been hardly any pushback on this drought and heat-induced tree mortality story. We published this thing, it's out there. But I hear foresters, when I talk to them, grumbling. Okay, now everybody publishing on this saying, yeah, but where I am in central Germany or in, northeastern US, the trees are growing off the scale. They're growing better than we've ever measured them. And this is true. And it was true in the 1980s and early 90s in the Southwest. But things can change. And the warming temperature is the thing that makes some of us nervous about trends moving forward all over. And indeed, this tree mortality associated with all these biotic agents, bark beetles in western North America, this is just through 2010. I mean, it's continued like this across the West, except up here in British Columbia, where basically the lodgepole pine isn't there anymore because the mountain pine beetle has done such a job there. But it's all over the planet. So it's not just Western North America. This was 2011. It killed 6%. The drought, an extreme drought heat event in Texas, killed 6% of the trees in Texas, they estimate. And it was all across. It wasn't just in the drier West Texas parts. It was in the east. It was actually spatially well distributed across Texas. Of course, a lot of mortality has been going on in the Sierra Nevada and of California the last 5-6 years associated with the big drought there. Some very cool work on what you can do with remote sensing. I think offers some opportunities to apply that in other places, to be able to basically just see how much water stress is in the canopies. Once we start to have baseline, I think we're going to be able to again do empirical models that are going to exceed what we can do with process-based models for the near future. And again, it turns out this stuff's going on all over the planet. Not everywhere at once all the time, but the common denominator for where these episodes happen, where they're documenting, and in some cases where they're clearly outside the historic range of variability, at least the period of the last 100, 150 years, where we have historical records, is it's not just drought, but it's hotter drought, because these places are warming. An example here, also 2011, Southwest Australia, just east of Perth, Australia. There, a little bitty mountain range. This tree, they thought, I was there in February of 2011 interacting with these folks. And they're about forest health issues, and they were all about biotic agents historically. And they said, yeah, drought, we've been monitoring it, and it's been droughty here, but this tree is invulnerable. In the 130 years of record we have, we've never seen these trees die by drought. A month later, I'm getting emails from these folks saying, ooh, the canopies collapsed, 10, 12 days after you left. Because there was this extreme heat wave went on top of this second driest year on record, right? So February, this is summer. This is getting to be late summer in that part of the world, southern hemisphere. And so the heat wave at the end of this thing pushed eucalypts, and a lot of them aren't real good at closing their stomata, so we're pretty sure this was a cavitation event. And the canopies collapsed. So I got back out there, 13, Yeah, 13 and looked at it again. But I mean, they've done some really nice work. There's a whole series of articles coming out on this. And this one came out just a little bit ago. Katinka Ruthroff was part of that same group. And there they linked it to what was also going on in the ocean off the west coast of Australia at the same time from that heat wave event, which had all kinds of impacts. Check this out. This is kind of a cool article. But extreme event, I mean, in the ocean, it's a big deal, even with buffering by the water, but it's the same thing. The organisms are tuned to that historic range of variability, not just of means, but to what the extremes are. The extremes are these filters. And so, so we summarized this stuff, and we see it happens everywhere, and we did this, and so you guys saw this yesterday, right? The world, there's dots. I find these dot maps really unsatisfying, so I'm kind of tired of looking at them, and I'm not going to do any more of them, okay? But people ask me for a while. They've served whatever purpose. They help sort of raise the profile of the issue. But, so, this is published now. This came out this year, 2018, the map I did for this one. But again, drought has happened in the past. We know drought kills trees. This isn't new. You know, people have been working on this. These are some reviews, but you can find literature back. This is nothing new, in a sense. And in many places on the planet, trees are growing better than we ever measured. So, is something new going on? Well, this is the big new thing on the planet to worry about. Okay? From a lot of standpoints. Societally as well, extreme events, there's issues with this. So anyway, warming is happening. And the projections are it's going to warm a lot. And in fact, we are on, this is sort of the famous hockey stick. So this is, paleo projections in the past from multiple lines of evidence, tree rings and corals and other things. Here's the instrumental record. Here is the period through, this is only through 2005. I think this is from an older IPCC report, but I haven't found as nice of a graphic showing this quite this way. And these were all the different projections, depending on how seriously human societies globally take transition to a different kind of energy. Well, we're on the fast path, is what I can tell you, both in terms of emissions and in terms of the temperature. It's on this path. And that is the path in the last IPCC report, which they call this 8.5 report. And this is what the world looks like by the latter part of the century in terms of how much increased temperature that the models project temperature-wise. There's imperfections, of course, in the models, but the models have been pretty good with temperature as a whole because that is an aggregate global phenomenon. There's variability for all the kinds of things going on out there, but the planet is going to continue to get warmer. Oops. And that is going to affect these temperature-sensitive disturbance processes that affect forests and societies. And so we think, by the way, so this is a map of the global distribution of fires per year. And here in Western North America, we think that this is big stuff. Fire here, and it has big effects. But yeah, there's something going on here. But where's the big fire activity going on? This is human activity in the tropics. This is, encroachments on, there's the tropical moist forest on the equator in the Congo region. There's the Amazon, but agriculture and fires and pastoralism is moving into these areas. And there's August 22nd, this last summer. Where's fire activity on planet Earth? That's just one day. That other was averaged for a whole year, over a number of years. So anyway, everywhere on the planet, and projections are with warming, every kind of model shows increase in fire activity for all the reasons that sort of make sense just on first principles. In terms of the global tree mortality, as I mentioned yesterday's talk, there's not a vegetation model that I believe linked to climate at any broad spatial scale for a region, for a continent, for the globe, about the future of vegetation that I believe. Currently, there's a huge question in my mind whether forests and woody vegetation is the world going to get greener or browner? There are climate models, many of the climate models of vegetation say, and some people that are skeptical about the effects of CO2 on climate say, well, it's plant food. And it's just a good thing, actually. It just makes the world greener. And there are some benefits, because that same process of, think of the stomata, where they're losing water, and they have to lose some water to be open to get the CO2 in. But if the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is higher, you don't have to be open as long or as much to get the same amount of CO2 in. So there's an increase in water use efficiency of photosynthesis. For per water molecule you lose, you can get a little more carbon in and do more photosynthesis. That does work, and we see the planet greening. It's probably part of why forests are growing so well in a lot of places where water is not limiting recently. But when there's severe enough drought that the plants have to close their stomata, doesn't matter what the CO2 level in the atmosphere is, it's not going to help you at that point. And you've got all the other negatives that go on associated with the greenhouse effects and the warming that we see. And so this is why, again, a couple of years ago, there's still, we just don't, some of us feel like this is a bigger issue and more worrisome, and because there are these nonlinearities, these tipping points in these systems, that people aren't taking it quite serious enough. And there's a couple first principle kind of things that we put together in that paper, including that the difficulty of we're expecting, we make our decisions based upon the past, upon our experience. But climate is moving into new non-analog conditions, including extremes that none of our infrastructure is built for, and that our forests, the dominant species on any given site, if you're a 100-year-old tree, if you're an old tree anywhere, you came to dominance during a climate window that is not the window that we've experienced in the last decade, much less in the next 100 years moving forward. And so if these are kind of the mortality thresholds, and this is drought stress moving forward, and the just warming forcing this, you got these extreme events. Well, the mean, it's going to take a while, but the extreme events start to catch your attention sooner. And we're in that zone where we're seeing those extreme events, and it's those parts of the world where we've had extreme drought and heat events where we're seeing the impacts that are getting our attention. By the way, I see Barb back there. I don't mean to downplay the role of those really essential biotic agents known as bark beetles in the process. They're hugely important to the system, of course, but they're everywhere. These systems, they're part of the system. Anyway, these thresholds at the current climate space, only extreme events like the 50s drought or the early 2000s drought kill trees. That's only a small percent of the time. The climate is mostly in a space for a tree species, call it ponderosa pine. If this is the climate envelope for ponderosa pine in terms of temperature and precip, the vast majority of the time it works. And if you're on a difficult site or low elevation, all right, you get squeezed out in the 50s drought, but you come back in. As the climate envelopes move forward, the envelopes here, the vast majority of the time you're going to be beyond it. Okay? And we can't project that stuff right now. We know they exist. We know these thresholds are there. We see them physiologically. And it turns out, and this is a scenario where it's both getting drier and warmer, but it turns out that warming alone is probably going to be enough to do that in a lot of places, even if the precip doesn't change. And one of the issues for this, we're getting short on time, but this is just a simple thing. It turns out, well, let's just say this. I'll just tell you, if you do experiments, don't even look at this, just because it takes longer to explain it than to use words. When you do tree killing experiments by taking small trees and putting them in the lab, and you turn the water off, okay? And so you've got treatments, you got controls, you got treatments here, you turn the water off, and one set of the water off treatments you warm, they die faster when it's warmer. The time it takes for trees to die. There's all kinds of debate and experimentation about what are the physiological processes involved in that. But the point of that is that with warmer temperatures, a shorter drought is going to kill trees. Even if the distribution, and there's lots of short droughts and not very long droughts. So under cooler temperatures, only these few droughts that are on these really severe long duration ends of the curves were enough to kill trees. The 1950s drought, but nothing since the 50s until recently. But that somewhere, it moves that threshold back to where droughts that happen more often but are shorter are going to be tree killing droughts. So even if precip distribution doesn't change, warming alone would be expected to cause more tree mortality on more sites more often. And I definitely won't talk about this. If you want to read the thing, because we don't have time. But we tried to review in that paper, the 2015 paper, is more than 400 references, trying to look at the spectrum of information that says, there's lesser vulnerability, there's good news. in this. There's a lot of information that, trees are growing well here. There's these various compensatory factors. There's a lot of different ways that we could expect trees to continue to do well, even on the same sites moving forward. And then we look at, there's other kinds of evidence showing not. And then there's some first principle stuff here in the middle that we think pushes us in the direction of being a little more worried. In this is a Brashears diagram. He wanted it all in one diagram, Dave Brashears. So this is it, his vortex of death spiral graphic. And but there, I mean, I make a little bit light of it, but it's there's a lot of concern. The trend we're on, 4 degrees C is too much. So and that's what we're looking at, or worse, in this century. That's beyond glacial, interglacial kind of transitions when we know that stuff is at equilibrium has to shift. And all these processes are going to shift. But we can't tell you when. Can't tell you, do we have 10 years? Do we have 30? Do we have 50? But, and anyway, these climate sensitive, there's interactions among them. Here's a diagram again. I showed this for the Amazon out of the IPCC, one of the last IPCC reports, of these interactions of warming, drought, forest fires, tree mortality from stress, clearing, changing the microenvironment, more CO2, more warming. I did a thing, this was a 2007 paper I did in ecosystems, trying to look at the interactions across spatial scales between these disturbance processes. The spaghetti diagram, I don't expect anybody to remember anything of it, except that it's all connected. These processes are connected across spatial scales and between processes. And when you change these overriding things like landscape scale grazing or climate, you're changing these processes that then have reverberations through these systems. So anyway, it's, as we discussed a little bit, it's particularly bad news for big trees. And, I talked about that at the end yesterday. And then to close, just say there are a few things that can be done. And that's another whole set of talks. I talked about some of that last year a little bit. But there are these tipping points that also affect human communities. It's not just physical systems or hydrological systems or biological systems. And we're starting to see this in the Southwest. I mentioned that it was a social tipping point, having to shut down their water supplies of the biggest city in the state. And it changes the dynamic of how people are interacting. Anyway, the stuff, I think we're going to start to see more of this. Sometimes people who think about these kind of issues a lot get a little gloomy because there's so much inertia inlaid in our individually and collectively in societies. It's hard to change. There's a lot of resistance to it. There's vested interests. But the forests in the western U.S. don't really care about our politics or our policies. They're starting to adjust to the warmer and drier climate as they must for all these kinds of process reasons that are going on. These are natural responses to changing environmental drivers. But we, as a society, keep being surprised by these things. But we're going to continue to be surprised. So, because there's more of these nonlinear threshold responses coming. They're embedded in chemical, physical, hydrological, biological processes. And in the East, I think wetter places are probably a little too complacent about thinking because, again, this sense of, just like it's an analog for the 1980s and early 90s in the Southwest. If that's your reference period, you think it's going to be okay. But warmer temperatures is part of what's destabilized that in the Southwest U.S. This is temperature from 1900 to 2000 across the U.S. And the thing to note is that the Southeast actually hasn't really warmed. So, and what's happened is there's been some drought in the Southeast, but it hasn't had hotter drought yet. There's been warming, some modest warming in the Northeast, but it's been wetter overall in recent decades. They haven't been challenged yet. Forests in the Northeast, you talk to forest ecologists in the East, they're worried about exotic pests and other things. They're not worried about this yet, but they will. Similarly with fire. Human ignitions, this came out last year. Jennifer Balch, this is great work. Here in the West, all this blue, the red stuff is the percent of human ignitions. So the dry parts of California, Central Valley, and Southern California. Basically, where are there lots of thunderstorms? And in the Intermountain West, lightning drives, but look, the number of ignitions in the east from humans is amazing. The amount of WUI, wildland urban interface in the east, embedded in all this is amazing. The amount of above ground biomass, which to a fire person is fuel, is amazing. The climate just hasn't been suitable for it to burn. But it doesn't take that long out there. Remember the Smokies, Gatlinburg, 2 falls ago? Okay, several people died in that. That was like 6 weeks of drought. Caused that to make it available. One good severe drought in the east and you're going to see all hell break loose in terms of stuff dying and burning. And yeah, that's Gatlinburg. All right, and we know it can do this. This is part of the world I grew up in. These were million-acre fires that were occurring in the late 1800s, associated with sloppy use of fire in part. People were using it to clear landscapes. But climatologically, these places can support firestorms. Anyway, as things change, and we're going to be surprised, we're going to increasingly need to anticipate, adapt to, and begin managing for an uncertain future range of variability. And this is where you all are so important, because you're going to be part of that learning curve. Because there's an immense amount of societal learning to do, and it's going to happen at all levels. And there's a part for researchers and scientists and land managers and citizens at large. But history is increasingly not as good a guide to future of how ecosystems are going to behave. And so anyway, these are some priorities that I lay out in terms of, but these thresholds, hotter drought surprises. What needs to be done from a research standpoint? These kind of nonlinear threshold tipping point responses, we need to know where those are and where they affect society so we can make the right investments. We need to know much more about the role of extreme events moving forward. These disturbance interactions and feedbacks are, again, we cannot incorporate them properly into models yet. Not even individual disturbances in big picture models very well, much less the interactions between them. And in general, there's an art paper here you could check out if you want, but this notion of there's some USGS, there's a little push for this notion. This is a buzzwordy kind of thing. Anticipatory natural resource science and management. But basically, we should be looking ahead, not waiting till we're surprised and kicked in the teeth by something. We should be thinking about it and trying to prep for it. Anyway, that's kind of the summary slide. Warming generates surprises. And I would say coming soon to a landscape near you, no matter where you are on this planet, there are some of these kinds of tipping point surprises coming because that amount of warming is just too much. The past systems have to readjust. So it's this kind of gloomy, kind of sounding thing. And so the last slides are just, there are things we can do. I don't talk about them at all here today. But it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. There are ways to manage these systems. We know ways. Part of the value of knowing the history of these sites is we know what combinations of climate and vegetation were resilient over long time periods. I just like this picture, so I put it in. I use this one of my kids, 2 of them when they were small. Not worried about these issues. But the point is, people, that's an alligator bark juniper, and people, there is hope because once it becomes crystal clear enough for society, there will be a societal tipping point, I'm quite sure. And I don't think it's that far away because the cost of it, just the pure economics of it, in a lot of really conservative quarters, economists are saying, this is nuts, we need to be, it's going to cost us so much, we should be investing, we should be doing things different, and there's economic opportunities. But we need to act, if we care about forests, we need to act with some urgency, we need to work together collaboratively, continue to learn and expect surprises, and that is the last slide. So, thank you.